Well, I don't know whether it's an interesting question, but I ask it nonetheless. I've very interesting presentation, both of them. They were slightly apart, but I have two questions for both presentations. I mean, starting with others was very interesting, this set of indicators. What I wondered a bit was, I mean, point one, do you foresee any trade-offs between all these various indicators? I mean, you're kind of working towards some composite indicator of individual development, but aren't there any trade-offs? For example, if you look at the case of Singapore, where you have a trade-off between being rich and being not fully free. So in a sense, what kind of trade-offs do you foresee? Secondly, also, I mean, many of these indicators, they are about development. I mean, you want to kind of improve on all indicators, you want to improve the state of the human person. But how do you deal with value conflicts? Because, I mean, on some indicators, I think the directions are pretty universally agreed. I mean, nobody wants to have piracy, except a few pirates. But on some other of your indicators, I think it's much more normatively disputed what the goal should be. I mean, if you look at belief systems, censorship, like in many countries, certain publications are banned because of moral standards of the population. So there's not really clear what kind of publications you want to have. For example, like I'm from Holland now, whatever, so I mean, we have many people who love soft drugs, which are banned in most other countries. So how do you deal with these kind of normative conflicts that you have in quite a few issues? And I think that's actually quite difficult to find a universal standard for many of the indicators you had. I think it's quite difficult to agree on a universal standard. Coming to the other presentation, very interesting. I have lots of questions, but I don't want to use them all. Just one point, the G20 institutionalizations, how do you foresee it? And what are the proposals on how exactly these people are foreseeing an institutionalization of the G20? I mean, I found this quite frightening, actually, this Davos report in a way. So I think it's very important to really have this reader guides and make people aware of these developments. And also, what are the reactions of the other of the G20 countries about this? Because, I mean, I understand, or I would accept that some G20 countries, like the United States, for example, they might be pretty positive to this larger vision of including the private sector, etc. But what happens with China, for example? I mean, is China buying into a post-nation state global governance architecture? I think they have issues with this. I mean, preserving rather the state sovereignty and autonomy. And also, then the last point, public-private UN. What does it exactly mean? I mean, what's exactly the vision? I mean, we have this partnership approach, whatever, so, but to what extent do they foresee also involving the private sector in UN affairs? Because there are various options also to really institutionalize the private sector involvement in the UN. And is this something that is also now thought about in Davos, or maybe not? Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation, thanks.
Well, maybe to respond to the question about trade-offs and value conflicts, we already had this problem when we were developing Sustainable Development Indicators after Rio, and I helped to lead the process in the UN to develop those indicators. And we only were able to move forward when it was agreed that we would come up with a menu of indicators which governments could select those relevant to their own definition of sustainability in their own cultural context. So they would not be used for comparisons between countries. They would sort of be self-selected as ways of measuring their progress towards the goals as they define them. And I think that there's no way you can get one single set of universal values imposed on everybody, because cultures are different. And what works in Inuit peoples in the far north won't work with migrating peoples in the Sahara or whatever. So there needs to be a certain flexibility, but transparency is important. That everybody agrees these are the values in our own community, our own nation that we find important. I think Bhutan has sort of set the example of saying we're not going to accept GDP, we're going to define our own measure of development, capturing our Buddhist spiritual values and putting what is important. And so I think that has to be the approach here, not one that sort of, you create a framework to say these are the things we should be measuring, but how you measure and evaluate the progress is something that needs to be done as part of a dialogue within the society or culture or community, but transparently as far as well. Now, there's always the issue, of course, you have human rights, which you are supposed to be sort of a universal foundation and should apply everywhere. And I think there's always going to be a certain delicate balance between global definitions of what are basic human rights and some countries that say, but those don't apply to women because in our culture, women are animals and not human beings or something like that. So we're always going to have a certain number of, certain process of dialogue and debate. And what are things that the world community sees are universal and essential? What are things where we need to encourage diversity because human societies have that richness of expression and should be allowed to express it in different ways? But I think it needs to be an open and transparent debate, and the whole community to carry these things together is what is acceptable, not acceptable in that framework.
Yeah.
Could you maybe respond?
Should I answer that?
Oh, yeah. Yes. The other question.
The proposals for the institutionalization of the G20 is that, unlike the G7, G8, it should have a permanent home and a permanent secretariat. To resolve the problem that plagued the G7 and G8 about which country to put the staff in, the Davos suggestion is that it be put in one of the developing countries with staff on loan from the previous presidency, the current presidency, and the future presidency. That unlike the G7, G20, it should engage with the rest of the world through the United Nations by both regularly briefing the Economic and Social Council on their activities, and to hear from other countries what their views are of the G20 proposals. That the incoming, current, and outgoing presidents should be a troika of decision-making for planning the subsequent sessions, not just the host country. Those are key elements of a proposal for how to institutionalize the G20. The members of the G20 don't necessarily agree with what Davos is suggesting for the role of the G20. So some members, like China, may feel more comfortable with some of the suggestions about how to institutionalize the G20, but not on multi-stakeholder corporate governance approaches. But I actually do not have firsthand knowledge of the Chinese views of the Davos proposals. On the public-private United Nations, and I don't have a good name for it, you can see this in three sets of ways. At the policy level, at the intergovernmental level, is that on a multi-stakeholder governance approach, those key firms or key countries or key civil societies, groups which put these together, would be seen as carving off issues from the international agenda that should be handled by the smaller multi-stakeholder group, and therefore, in a sense, taking them away from potential topics for the overall membership to address. There are two or three other ways in which the policy system could be impacted by the multi-stakeholder approach, but that's just one of them. On the staff side is that the Davos proposals are that UN staff as professionals should be asked to join multi-stakeholder activities, but to be paid for by their regular salaries in order to both gain their technical competence in the project, but also to, in their view, reflect the views of other governments about the subject. Conversely, there are some proposals that are made that the UN should host multi-stakeholder activities, and in effect, then, the UN and the regular budget would be funding the UN's participation, staff participation, in multi-stakeholder governance activities, beyond whatever it is that the staff has been obligated to do. And the third sphere is on finance. It's clear that countries have effectively, for 20 or 30 years, frozen the UN budget. And so there's appeals in the papers that when companies see parts of the UN system which are in line with either their firm-specific interests or the multi-stakeholder governance outcomes, is to provide project financing to the United Nations. And as a proportion of the budget to the UN, the size, what the companies could put in from their marketing budgets is relatively small for them, but rather large of its impact for the UN budget. So in that sense, at both the policy level, at the staff level, at the budget level, financing level, there are significant changes possible in this public-private concept of a United Nations.
Okay,
What happened to Archie?
my question, my question links up to the previous question and your answers to Mr. Harris. As in your presentation and also in your answer, you were quite informative on information on how these things are planned or are suggested. What is your opinion on the effectiveness of especially the voluntary multi-stakeholder constructions for moving towards sustainability? As an academic scholar, I think yesterday you had a critical question about partnerships and definitions. So what is your assessment of how well that may function?
Shall we take 2 or 3 questions and then we can? Yes.
Okay. Here?
Yes.
Very, very interesting presentations. So once again, thank you very much for those. And now I will go on to reflect some confusion in my own mind on some of the questions. To me, it seemed that both the presentations raise a number of questions on the legitimacy of what is being proposed, in a sense. In I think Arthur's presentation, as also I think in your presentation, Harry, was the issue of representation on different governing bodies. And the issue of legitimacy comes, as was raised yesterday, in the context of civil society organizations, but equally in the case of corporate entities. And in your specific case, you spoke about the World Economic Forum. And if you look at the World Economic Forum, and there are many other corporate bodies as well, the questions that come to mind, apart from the issue of legitimacy, is again, when we talk about a public-private, before that, when we talk about legitimacy and representation, is it only at an international level, or are we also looking at mechanisms at a national level so that that representation actually derives bottom-up rather than plugs in at one level somewhere? And the second is that when we talk about a public-private United Nations, in the absence of anything that is coming bottom-up, are we really talking about multinational organizations? And then does that militate against these whole concept of equality, and does it magnify inequalities? So I hope I'm not confused, but I think there's a whole bunch of questions.
I had a question for Arthur. I'm trying to make sense of this trend towards the individual in the global development debate in a bit of a larger historical context. And one element of that context, it seems to me, is the general Western-led individualization that we've seen over the last 20, 30, or 40 years. And I wonder, on the one hand, of course, I think it's good to focus on the individual and the rights of the individual. But I wonder if, on the other hand, that also opens the door to the separation of the individual from its context, whereby suddenly, if you have to check no on a question like, and I quote here, having a purpose and vision in life, that means that the blame then suddenly goes to the individual as well. And I think in the larger context of the individualization of society, we see manifestations of this where, say, stresses on people that emerge in the context of work or private lives are increasingly dealt with as psychological defaults that can be addressed with drugs. So provocatively speculating, are we going to a world where there's going to be a drug for failing at the individual level for sustainability?
Well, I'll respond to that last question, but first, I'm sorry.
Is it okay if I just
Yeah, okay,
want to
yeah.
add just one last point in conjunction with what was said? Some of the points were raised by Frank and other participants. I just wanted to ask a question. When you talk about multi-stakeholder approach, why don't we think in terms of companies, corporations, and citizens that could eventually have a different agenda? Why don't you bring them in this sort of institutional approach? You talked about institutionalizing Harris G20, which obviously poses a problem in terms of what could be the implications once we have a new institution or institutional format. And then where do we stop? Do we go from G20 to 25 or 30 and 35?
I think with respect to individualization, I tried in the framework I was setting up to leave a lot of room for recognition that many cultures, the individual shouldn't be standing out, but they are families, they're communities, there's a much more collective approach to things. And that is why I sort of going from the basics of each individual human being moved up into the sense of community, belonging, and therefore leaving room for communities to decide together. And this doesn't have to be, they can be as equally collective as individual sets of values or visions of life. And I think that's what Bhutan had tried to do in their own thinking, reflecting, a whole sort of a national culture, and saying that, in their culture, it's not the individual standing out, but an individual, sees his as being of service to the community, as being part of that larger ensemble. And so I tried to identify a set of indicators that would leave room for that range from American individualism at one extreme, which may not be very healthy in a sense, and lead to a drug-driven culture because I'm sure could make a lot of money out of that. Multinationals would find some drugs for this and they'd be able to be very profitable. But it's something very far from most of human society or civilization, which is not so individual. And so I tried to flag the need to include those collective dimensions in that. And the indicators can easily be designed not to reflect only individual perspectives, but also reflect those larger perspectives as they're adapted to the different situations. So, it's one that we have to be very sensitive about, because there is the tendency in Western thinking to individualize much too much. But we still are human beings, even when we are a family, we have multiple generations, and it's the balance of the two that needs to be explored and that needs to be reflected in those indicators. And I tried to capture some of that in the indicators at the higher levels of treatment. With respect to legitimacy, again, ultimately legitimacy should be coming from the grassroots. People should be empowered to make their own decisions of what their priority is, of where they want to go, and they support it because they've agreed to it and that they feel their needs and they know what's important, and they may want to feature material needs, they may want to feature spiritual needs, they may want to feature collective needs. They should have the capacity to do that. And I tried again to identify indicators that would be part of providing people with that capacity so that in fact they would not be deprived of that capacity. They wouldn't have had the education to make those choices and so on. So I think that is an essential part of creating a foundation that then goes to other levels, because it's always what are CSOs' legitimacy, what are corporations' legitimacy, what are elected governments' legitimacy when there's manipulation of the political process. So it's not, I think everywhere you can question legitimacy, and one of our goals in sustainability should be to say, how do we strengthen true legitimacy? And how do we make sure that it's anchored in the real needs and desires of people and not being imposed by one of the false legitimacies that is sometimes, brought in from other levels?
Many of the issues that are coming up and are raised by the Davos approach challenge settled issues in international relations and legitimacy. And in a sense, the debate has become unsettled, and therefore we have to, in some fashion, look differently at the issues. And there's where the challenge is. We spent 200 to 300 years developing the concept of state responsibility, state liability, state obligations. And now there's proposals, and we have practice. Marine Stewardship Council, Forest Stewardship Council, the Kimberley process, where there are multinational actors, civil society actors, and governments who have a terrain where all the issues about obligations, responsibilities, liabilities, that approach of rule of law is undeveloped. And that is the challenge, both for the academic side, is to step back and say, where are some of the assumptions which we have been using in international relations courses and approaches, which are now being challenged by new forms, some of which are in practice. But what is intriguing from an academic and a scholarly perspective is you have at least one coherently broad argument presented for how they should relate to each other. That argument, however, does not address liabilities, obligations, expectations. It does not address representative issues at all. Considering that there was a very high number of academic scholars amongst the 700 who advised and took part in the Davos process, some of this is a little surprising to me. So on the question of representativeness, if you have a multi-stakeholder group, and think of the ones which you know of that currently exist, how do you determine which group of countries, which group of civil societies, and which group of companies or industrial sectors ought to be part of that group who is deferred to as handling that issue? And if once you've decided on the sectors or the types of civil society groups and the types of governments, how do you pick the individual firms, the individual NGOs, the individual countries to represent that division? And further, how do you then decide what individual is designated by the company to speak on behalf of that firm, or the NGO to speak on behalf of that NGO? Does the chief executive officer appoint somebody? Is it the whole set of hierarchies of authority for representativeness is not at all addressed. Those who are international lawyers and others may know that presenting credentials, which sounds a little arcane, is the way in which in the nation-state process you confirm who is the individual who has been designated to speak on behalf of that country. So what's the challenge on the multi-stakeholder structures are quite widespread. And I think that we haven't done our homework well on which ones exist, of which there are a large number of different forms. At the part of the Reader's Guide, there are about 12 different forms of the structures of multi-stakeholders, structures currently in existence and proposed by Davos. The transformation that's important, in my view, is between multi-stakeholder consultation, where the nation-state is the recipient of advice or being lobbied by the different constituent groups, a multi-stakeholder group who take on a particular project, let's say figuring out how to make the university buildings more energy efficient, and a multi-stakeholder group that is involved in governance, which would come up with standards for what should constitute an energy-efficient university building anywhere in the terrain. It's the transformation between the consultative role, the project role, into multi-stakeholder governance, which is the crucial transformation that I'm trying to draw attention to. And in my earlier comments, I draw quite concern about using the word partnership to cover all three of those forms, because they are, in my view, quite distinct. I have just one other observation which relates to the question that was raised back in the back. There is this rather odd convention called the Vienna Convention on Conventions, which lays out by governments over the years how it is that they are to make international law and how are they to treat representatives of the other countries in diplomatic privileges. In some sense, as we are moving toward, or the extent to which we do move toward, multi-stakeholder governance in various areas, this is the new set of rules that we have to craft, even for the Marine Stewardship Council, the Forest Stewardship Council, and for all the ones which some people regard them as doing productive work. We need a new set of rules, and in that sense, why I was raising that things which were settled have now become unsettled. This is an example of an area of work that may be worth undertaking. Thank you.